Good afternoon for me. I don't know what time you all will be watching this, but I hope you are well and um, getting the hang of this new online way of doing Gustavus. Not a great hang of it because I hope that this doesn't happen again, but for the spring, I hope we're having a hang of it. Today we're beginning our section on reconstructing the United States. So last week you watched some videos on debates about slavery preceding the Civil War, and then the creation of race and the ways that Christianity and race intersected in the United States. Today, we're really continuing that discussion by looking at the period after the Civil War, really up to the very beginning of the 20th century. So, if you want to think of this as roughly 1865 to 1900, that's close enough. Some of the readings from Dubois go a little bit into the 20th century. To start, this video is going to just do a quick recap with you of your readings from Strong and Dubois by looking at two of their kind of central ideas or central paragraphs, and just to make sure we're all clear on their central ideas. So I want to start with Strong's Our Country and see what he is doing here, what his claim is about America and about the role of Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. So this is from Our Country. He says, thus, while on this continent God is training the Anglo-Saxon race for its mission, a complemental work has been in progress in the great world beyond. God has two hands. Not only is he preparing in our civilization the die with which to stamp the nations, but by what Southey calls the timing of providence, he is preparing mankind to receive our impress. Is there room for reasonable doubt that this race, meaning the Anglo-Saxon Protestant race, unless devitalized by alcohol and tobacco, is destined to dispossess many weaker races, assimilate others, and mold the remainder until, in a very true and important sense, is Anglo-Saxonized mankind? Already the English language, saturated with Christian ideas, gathering up into itself the best thought of all the ages, is the great agent of the Christian thought throughout the world. Okay. I'm going to guess that Strong's point wasn't really hard to grasp, but just to be clear, for Strong, as we've seen before, Anglo-Saxon, so really English culture, and Protestant Christianity go together and underwrite both liberty and progress. And what he sees here, sorry, my voice just cracked. I guess I'm going through puberty now. What he sees here is the possibility of the development of humankind, but a development towards an apex, which is Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. He says that there might be some possibility for some groups to assimilate, become Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and he seems to suggest that others will simply disappear. For Strong, this way of viewing the world underwrites both the movement of white Americans west on this continent, but also increasingly their movement out into the world through both the missionary movement, which really ramped up at the end of the 19th century, and eventually through more direct conquest. That's already happening in Europe and then will happen with the United States more directly at the end of the 19th century. One thing to note here is that Strong is not an evangelical. He might sound like one, but just keep this in your heads. I'm not going to go into it right now. He is really more of a liberal Protestant. He's more on the side that is going to have a broader interpretation of the Bible. He's not a common sense realist, as we talked about last week. And that just goes to say that at the end of the 19th century, both more conservative Protestants and more liberal Protestants, and we're going to talk more about those two categories next week, really saw Anglo-Saxon civilization as the inevitable civilization in the world. They differed a little bit on how they thought that would happen, but they both thought that Anglo-Saxons were destined by God to win. W.E.B. Du Bois has a very different view, as you might expect. Du Bois is one of the most important African American thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th century. He is possibly best known for one line where he said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And he wrote extensively on what it was like to be an African American at the end of the 19th century. This piece comes from a larger book called The Souls of Black Folk. If you haven't read it, and I don't imagine you would, it's not something people assign in high schools, I really recommend it. It's one of the classics of American literature, and he is an amazing writer and a very incisive writer. His writing, unfortunately, still feels very modern in many, many ways. So this is Du Bois, not talking too strong, but talking to strong-esque thinking. People who have written the African American experience out of the American narrative. Here's what he says. Your country? How came it yours? Before the pilgrims landed, we were here. Here we have bought your three gifts and mingled them with yours. A gift of story and song, soft stirring melody in an ill-harmonized and unmelodious land. The gift of sweat and brawn to beat back the wilderness, conquer the soil, and lay the foundations of this vast economic empire 200 years earlier than your weak hands could have done it. The third, a gift of the spirit. Around us the history of the land has centered for thrice 100 years. Out of the nation's heart we have called all that was best to throttle and subdue all that was worst. Fire and blood, prayer and sacrifice have billowed over this people, and they have found peace only in the altars of the God of right. Nor has a gift of the Spirit been merely passive. Actively have we woven ourselves with the very warp and woof of this nation. We fought their battles, shared their sorrows, mingled our blood with theirs. And then at the end he says, would America have been America without her Negro population? And his answer is obviously no. Du Bois sees a very different American story than Strong. Strong sees the American story as being about Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Du Bois sees an American story that wouldn't be the American story without Black people. Now, it's important to note that Du Bois does recognize a distinct place for African Americans. As you read in his credo, he wants people to have pride in their lineage and for Black people to have pride in their lineage. He's not calling for a kind of facile assimilation, but he wants the experiences, the sacrifices, the role of Black people to be acknowledged in the American experience. And then, again, going more to credo, he wants there to be room for African American people to develop their talents and their capabilities, which tells us that at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that wasn't what was happening in the United States. So in the next couple of videos, we're going to look at this moment in time and try and think through this tension between Strong's articulation of an American vision and Du Bois' very different articulation of that vision and what was happening at the end of the 19th century.